A racist security guard refused to let Shaquille O'Neal through to his jet. However, what happened next came as a complete surprise and shocked everyone around him. Find out how this incident changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Shaquille O'Neal stood on the balcony of his penthouse gazing out at the sprawling city below. The golden hues of the setting sun reflected off the skyscrapers, casting long shadows over the bustling streets. It was a view he had come to associate with success, a hard-earned vantage point that symbolized how far he had come from the modest beginnings of his childhood. But tonight, the view did little to quell the restless energy coursing through him. He was on the brink of making a decision that for him felt monumental. Owning a private jet had always been a dream, though not for the reasons most would assume. For many, a private jet symbolized extravagance and ego, a means to flaunt wealth and status. But for Shaquille, it was about something deeper: freedom, the freedom to move, to reach people and places without limitations, to expand his growing business empire, and most importantly, to fuel his philanthropic aspirations. He envisioned it as a tool, not a trophy. The idea had come to him during a recent trip to a remote community in the Midwest. He had been invited to speak at a school where students struggled with poverty and limited resources. The experience had left a profound impact on him. The children's wide-eyed curiosity and determination reminded him of his own childhood, growing up with big dreams and limited opportunities. It was on the flat-back CR, amped in a commercial plane, that the thought struck him: what if he had the means to reach these places more efficiently, to visit more schools, more communities, and provide real, tangible support? He ran his hand over his jaw, deep in thought. The decision wasn't just about logistics. It was about making a statement. It was about showing the world and himself that he had arrived at a place where he could dream even bigger. The ringing of his phone pulled him from his reverie. He glanced at the screen. It was Mark, his longtime business advisor and close friend, Shaquille there. Mark's voice came through with its usual brisk energy. "Yeah, I'm here, just thinking," Shaquille replied, his voice steady but contemplative. "About the jet, right? I know that tone." Mark chuckled on the other end. "So what's the verdict? Are you going for it?" Shaquille hesitated for a moment, then exhaled. "I think I am. It's not just for me, Mark. You know that I do, and I respect it. But you've got to be sure. This is a big investment, and it'll come with its own set of challenges. People are going to talk. You know how they are." Shaquille leaned against the railing, letting the evening breeze cool his thoughts. He knew what Mark meant. Despite his success, he was no stranger to scrutiny. His every move was analyzed, criticized, and often misunderstood. But this wasn't about public opinion. It was about his vision, his purpose. "I've thought about that," he said finally, "but I can't let fear dictate my decisions. This isn't just about me flying in luxury. It's about creating opportunities, breaking barriers. And if people want to talk, let them. I'll show them what this jet is really for." Mark paused, then replied with a note of approval. "That's what I wanted to hear. All right, let's make it happen. I'll start pulling some options for you to review over the next few weeks." The process of selecting the right jet began. Shaquille threw himself into the details, immersing himself in a world he had never explored before. He visited hangars, spoke with manufacturers, and weighed the pros and cons of different models. Each visit brought a new sense of excitement and clarity. The jets themselves were marvels of engineering, sleek, powerful, and designed with precision. But beyond the aesthetics, Shaquille was drawn to their potential. He finally settled on a model that struck the perfect balance between luxury and practicality. Who was spacious enough to accommodate his team and guests, equipped with cutting-edge technology, and had the range to reach the most remote corners of the country. The day he signed the papers, he felt the surge of pride and anticipation. This was it. His vision was coming to life. The first time he stepped aboard the jet, it was like walking into a new chapter of his life. The interior was immaculate, with leather seats, polished wood accents, and panoramic windows that offered breathtaking views of the sky. But what excited him most was the opportunity it represented. He could already picture the lives he would touch, the places he would go, and the change he would inspire as the weeks passed. Shaquille's excitement grew. He began planning his first flight, a trip to visit several communities where he had ongoing projects. The itinerary was packed, but he was eager to hit the ground running. This wasn't just a new mode of transportation, it was a new way of life. On the eve of the inaugural flight, stood in his living room staring at a framed photo of his younger self. In the picture, he was a lanky teenager with an oversized basketball, his eyes full of hope and determination. He smiled, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him here. "You've come a long way," he murmured to himself, but the work's just beginning. As he turned off the lights and prepared for the day ahead, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow, he would take to the skies, not just as a symbol of his success, but as a beacon of what was possible. What he didn't know was that his first flight would bring challenges he could never have anticipated, testing his resolve and reshaping his mission in ways he could not yet imagine. The morning of Shaquille's inaugural flight arrived with the promise of clear skies and endless possibilities. The sun bathed the private airstrip in a warm glow as Shaquille's car rolled through the gates. He leaned back in the plush leather seat, savoring the moment. This was at the beginning of a new chapter. The jet, a masterpiece of sleek engineering and custom design, gleamed on the tarmac like a beacon of achievement. As the car pulled up to the hangar, Shaquille stepped out, greeted by the hum of activity around him. Technicians and crew members moved with practiced efficiency, readying the plane for departure. The air smelled faintly of aviation fuel and freshly cut grass, mingling with the crisp breeze. Shaquille adjusted his tailored blazer and strode toward the jet with an easy confidence. He was proud of what this moment represented, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever dared to dream bigger than their circumstances. The calm was shattered when a voice called out from behind him, "Hey, you hold it right there." Shaquille turned his brow, furrowing. A security guard approached, his posture stiff and his expression stern. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor anything but welcoming. Shaquille stopped in his tracks, unsure of what had prompted the interruption. "Can I help you?" Shaquille asked, keeping his tone polite. The guard's eyes narrowed as he looked Shaquille up and down. "This is a private airstrip. You're not supposed to be here." Shaquille tilted his head slightly, taken aback by the man's tone. "I know, I'm here for my flight," he replied, gesturing toward the jet. "That's my plane." The guard let out a sharp laugh, more of a bark than a sound of amusement. "Your plane? That's funny. Now let's see some ID." Shaquille's patience was already wearing thin, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out his driver's license and a laminated card verifying his ownership of the jet. The guard snatched them from his hand, his eyes darting between the documents and Shaquille. "This can't be right," the guard muttered under his breath. He glanced up, his expression twisting with suspicion. "How exactly did you afford a plane like this?" Shaquille's jaw tightened. He had encountered prejudice before, but it never failed to sting. "I worked for it," he said evenly. "Now, if you're done, I'd like to get to my flight." The guard didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice lowering, but losing none of its hostility. "Look, buddy, I don't know what kind of SCMM you're running, but I've seen this kind of thing before. You don't belong here." The accusation hit like a slap. Shaquille squared his shoulders, his imposing frame towering over the guard. But he kept his voice calm. "I don't know what you think you've seen, but this isn't a scam. I own that plane, and I have every right to be here." The guard's face hardened, and he crossed his arms. "We'll see about that. I'm calling the police." Before Shaquille could respond, the guard stepped away, pulling a radio from his belt. Shaquille stood there, his mind racing. He could feel the eyes of the crew on him, their curiosity tinged with unease. The sense of triumph that had filled him earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy nod of anger and disbelief. Within minutes, the wail of sirens broke through the quiet morning. 2 police cars pulled up, their lights flashing, and 4 officers stepped out. They approached the scene with measured steps, their hands resting on their belts. The guard rushed to meet them, gesturing animatedly in Shaquille's direction. Shaquille took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. He watched as the officers listened to the guard's account, their expressions shifting from neutrality to skepticism. Finally, one of them turned to him. "Sir, we're going to need to see your identification and proof of ownership for the aircraft," the officer said, his tone firm, but not devoid of the guard's overt hostility. Shaquille handed over his Documents again, keeping his movements deliberate, the officer examined them carefully, but the crease in his brow didn't ease. These looked legitimate, the officer said thinly, but his tone carried a note of doubt. Still, we're going to have to verify everything, you understand? Shaquille nodded, though his patience was wearing thin. I understand, but this is unnecessary. Everything you need is right there. The verification process dragged on. The officers called in the documents, cross-referencing them with aviation authorities. Shaquille stood by the jet, his arms crossed, while the guard hovered nearby, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. The crew had dispersed, giving the scene a wide berth, but their furtive glances spoke volumes. As the minutes turned into nearly an hour, Shaquille's frustration grew. Memories from his past began to resurface, moments when he had been underestimated, dismissed, or outright insulted because of the color of his skin, and he had thought he had left those experiences behind. But here they were again, rearing their ugly heads. Finally, one of the officers approached, holding the documents. Everything checks out, you're free to go, he said, his tone clipped as if he were reluctant to admit it. Shaquille took the papers and looked the officer square in the eye. That's it, no apology for wasting my time, for assuming I didn't belong here. The officer hesitated, but before he could respond, the guard interjected, look, we were just doing our job. You should be glad we're thorough. Shaquille's temper flared. Thorough? This wasn't thorough, this was profiling, plain and simple, and you know it. The guard's smirk faded, but he didn't respond. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before returning to their cars as the vehicles pulled away. Shaquille turned back to the jet. The moment that had once felt like a triumphant milestone now felt tarnished as he boarded the plane. His thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, disappointment, and resolve. He knew this was more than just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a deeper issue, one that couldn't be ignored. As the engines roared to life and the jet began to taxi down the runway, Shaquille stared out the window, his mind already turning to how he would respond. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The engines roared as Shaquille's jet lifted off the tarmac, but the usual thrill of flight eluded him. He stared out the window, the sprawling city below, gradually fading into a patchwork of fields and roads. His thoughts a storm of frustration and disbelief. What should have been a triumphant first flight in his new jet was overshadowed by the events that had unfolded on the ground. He gripped the armrest tightly, replaying the confrontation with the guard and the subsequent humiliation by the police. The memory of the guard's smirk was like a thorn in his mind. He could still hear the man's condescending voice dripping with suspicion and disdain. You don't belong here. Those words echoed in his head, each repetition stoking the fire of his anger. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the weight of the implication. No matter how far he had come, how much he had achieved, there were still people who saw him as less than, who believed he didn't deserve to stand where he did. Shaquille let out a frustrated sigh and leaned back in his seat. His assistant Laura, who had joined him for the flight, glanced at him from across the cabin. She hesitated before speaking, her voice soft but concerned. Shock, are you okay? He turned to her, forcing a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm fine, he said, though the tightness in his voice betrayed him. Laura tilted her head, studying him. You don't look fine. That was a lot back there. Shaquille's smile faded. He looked down at his hands, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. Yeah, he admitted quietly. It was. Laura set her tablet aside and leaned forward. You don't have to hold it all in. You know what happened back there wasn't right. Anyone could see that. Shaquille appreciated her words, but they did little to dull the sting of what he had experienced. It's not the first time, he said, his voice low. You'd think I'd be used to it by now, but you shouldn't have to be. Laura replied firmly. You've worked hard for everything you have. You earned that plane, just like you earned your success. No one has a right to question that. Her words resonated, but they also brought a wave of conflicting emotions. Shaquille had always prided himself on his resilience, his ability to rise above challenges and prove his worth through action, but this time felt different. This time, the humiliation cut deeper as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. Shaquille's mind drifted back to his childhood, He remembered a specific incident from his early school years, a memory he had buried but never truly forgotten. He was 8 years old, sitting in a classroom filled with other kids. It was career day, and everyone had been asked to share their dreams for the future. When his turn came, he stood up, his voice filled with excitement as he declared, "I'm going to be a basketball star." The room erupted in laughter. His classmates didn't believe him, and neither did the teacher, who had smiled indulgently and said, "That's a nice dream, Shaquille, but maybe you should think of something more realistic." That moment had stayed with him, a reminder of how people often judged him before they knew his potential. It wasn't just the laughter, it was the underlying message that he wasn't enough, that his dreams were too big for someone like him. The memory mingled with the events of the morning, creating a bitter cocktail of emotions. Laura's voice broke through his thoughts. "Shaq, what are you going to do about it?" He looked up, her question catching him off guard. "Do about what? About what happened? About the way they treated you? Are you just going to let it go?" Shaquille hesitated. His first instinct was to brush it off, to focus on the positive and move forward, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. This wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, everyone who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I can't let it slide. Not this time." Laura nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe this is an opportunity to make a statement, to show people that this kind of behavior isn't acceptable." Her words planted a seed in his mind. As the plane flew on, Shaquille began to consider how he could turn this experience into something meaningful. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but it was beginning to transform into something else. Resolve. The flight ended without incident, but the morning's events lingered like a shadow. As Shaquille stepped off the jet, he was greeted by a group of local organizers who had been eagerly awaiting his arrival. Their smiles and warm handshakes were a stark contrast to the hostility he had faced earlier, and for a moment he felt the glimmer of hope. One of the organizers, a middle-aged woman named Clara, led him to a group of children who had gathered to meet him. Their eyes lit up when they saw him, their excitement palpable. Shaquille knelt down to their level, listening as they shared their dreams and aspirations. It was moments like these that reminded him why he did what he did. But even as he engaged with the children, the memory of the guard's words lingered in the back of his mind. The injustice of it gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. As he boarded the car that would take him to his next destination, he pulled out his phone and opened the camera app. He hesitated for a moment, then hit record. Looking into the camera, he began to speak, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Today was supposed to be a celebration," he said. "The first flight in my new jet, a symbol of everything I've worked for. But instead I was met with suspicion, hostility, and doubt, not because I did anything wrong, but because of who I am and how I look. This isn't just about me, it's about a system that still judges people by the color of their skin, no matter how far they've come." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm sharing this because I know I'm not alone. There are so many people out there who face this kind of treatment every day, and it needs to stop. We need to have these conversations, even when they're uncomfortable. We need to demand better." He ended the video with a promise. "This isn't over. I'm going to make sure something good comes out of this, for me, for you, for all of us." As he hit the upload button and watched the video begin to spread, he felt a sense of clarity. The humiliation and anger were still there, but they were no longer just emotions. They were fuel for action, a catalyst for change. As Shaquille sat in the backseat of his car watching the video upload progress bar inch its way to completion, he felt a strange mix of nerves and anticipation. Sharing his story was not a decision he had made lightly, but it felt necessary, urgent. Even it wasn't just about him anymore, it was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, who had felt the sting of prejudice cutting through their accomplishments. When the video finally went live, Shaquille closed his phone and leaned back, staring out the window as the car sped toward his next destination. For the moment, there was nothing more he could do. The rest was up to the world. It didn't take long. By the time Shaquille reached his hotel, his phone was already buzzing relentlessly. Notifications flooded in. Comments, shares, messages of support. Laura, who had been monitoring the videos, Reach met him in the lobby, her expression a mix of amazement and urgency. "Shaq," she said, holding up her tablet, "you're trending, and I don't mean just a little. This thing is blowing up." Shaquille raised an eyebrow, taking the tablet from her hands. The video had been viewed over 500,000 times in just 2 hours, and the numbers were climbing rapidly. Social media was ablaze with discussions, the hashtags #flying while black and #Shay speaks out. Leading the charge, celebrities, activists, and ordinary people alike were weighing in, sharing their own stories of discrimination and rallying behind Shaquille's call for change. The comments were a mix of outrage and support. "This is disgusting. How does this still happen in 2024? Shaq, you're an inspiration. Thank you for speaking out. Every time I think we've made progress, something like this happens. We need to do better." But not all the reactions were positive. As always, there were detractors. Voices questioning his intentions, accusing him of overreacting or worse, fabricating the incident for attention. "Here we go again, playing the victim card. Maybe if you acted like you belonged there, this wouldn't have happened. Typical celebrity drama. Must be nice to have problems like this." Shaquille felt a flicker of anger as he scrolled through the negativity, but he pushed it aside. He hadn't shared his story for the trolls. He had done it for the people who understood, for those who needed to see that they weren't alone. The buzz continued to grow. By the evening, news outlets had picked up the story, and Shaquille found himself fielding interview requests from major networks. Laura sat across from him in the hotel lounge, a whirlwind of efficiency as she managed his schedule. "CNN wants to do a live interview tomorrow morning," she said, scrolling through her phone. "The New York Times is asking for a written statement. And there's an email from Oprah's team. They're interested in having you on her show." Shaquille ran a hand over his face, the weight of it all beginning to settle on his shoulders. "This is bigger than I expected," he admitted. "That's because it's not just about you," Laura said gently. "This is striking a chord with people. You've opened a door that a lot of folks have been waiting to walk through." Her words stayed with him that night as he lay in bed. Shaquille's thoughts were a blur of past and present. He remembered the moments of discrimination he had faced throughout his life, some blatant, others subtle, but all of them leaving their mark. He thought about the people who didn't have his platform, who couldn't share their stories with millions, and he thought about the future, about what he could do to make a difference. The next day, Shaquille stepped into the spotlight with a renewed sense of purpose. The CNN interview was his first public statement since the video went viral, and he approached it with equal parts determination and apprehension. Sitting across from the host, the studio lights casting a warm glow, he spoke candidly about what had happened. "This isn't just about me," he said, his deep voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to persist. I'm speaking out because I have the platform to do so, but there are so many people who face this every day and don't have a voice. That's who I'm doing this for." The interview was raw and powerful, and it only added fuel to the fire. By the end of the day, the story had gone global, sparking debates about race, privilege, and systemic bias. Social media continued to buzz with activity, and Shaquille found himself inundated with messages from people sharing their own experiences of prejudice and discrimination. One message in particular caught his attention. It was from a young man named Marcus who worked as a baggage handler at a small regional airport. Marcus wrote about how he had been repeatedly passed over for promotions despite his hard work and dedication, all because his supervisors assumed he wasn't management material. He thanked Shaquille for speaking out, saying that it gave him hope. Shaquille read the message twice, his chest tightening. Marcus's story was just one of many, but it underscored the importance of what he was doing. This wasn't just about exposing injustice. It was about empowering people to believe in their own worth, to fight for their place in a world that often tried to push them down. As the days went on, the conversation continued to grow. Activists and organizations reached out, offering their support and sharing ideas for how to turn the momentum into meaningful action. Shaquille began to see a path forward, a way to channel the anger and frustration he had felt into something positive. But not everyone was ready to embrace change. The management of the private